Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video, a surprise Sunday video. Now TV contacted me about a documentary they have coming up on Wednesday the 29th of January, all about the unsolved death of Tupac Shakur, and in a weird coincidence, I actually had it on my schedule to cover next month. So the stars aligned a bit here, and so this video is sponsored by Now TV. Now TV is a leading UK streaming service with some of the best TV, box sets, movies, sports, and kids entertainment, which you can watch when, where and how you want to watch. Sky Crime is the new home of premium US true crime from Oxygen and HBO, and it's now available on Now TV. When I tell you that these documentaries are high quality, I really mean it. These are some of the best accounts of true crime I've ever seen. Sky Crime will take you on a journey through some of the most harrowing and shocking crimes you've ever heard of. It will make you question everything. It's no secret that true crime is really popular at the moment, and Sky Crime gives you the most well-rounded, high-quality looks into some huge cases. And this video is going to focus on one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries ever, the murder of Tupac Shakur. The documentary Notorious, Tupac Shakur is available to stream from Wednesday the 29th of January via the Now TV Entertainment Pass, which costs $8.99 a month. So, as I said, you've probably heard of Tupac. You've probably heard of the mystery surrounding his murder. Today I'm going to share with you the story behind what happened, because it's a lot more intricate than I ever realised. He was born June 16th, 1971 in East Harlem, Manhattan. He was actually born Lausanne Parish Crooks, and his mum changed his name to Tupac Amaru Shakur when he was just 1 year old. He was born just a month after his mum was acquitted of more than 150 charges of conspiracy against the United States government and New York landmarks. Both of his parents were active members of the Black Panthers in New York. Being raised around such a strong Black Power movement, around so much art and revolution, would greatly go on to impact his later music. In 1988, the family relocated to Marin City, California, when Tupac would have been around 17 years old. It's here in California that his career really begins to take off. By the time he's 25, he's the brightest star in hip-hop, a name that everyone knows. His music touched people. He rapped openly about the pains of poverty and racism. He spoke of gang culture. He captured the complexity of emotions in words, and he was the standard to which aspiring hip-hop artists held themselves. He was considered a poet. And that made his sudden death heartbreaking for millions. It was the 7th of September 1996 when Tupac and Suge Knight, the CEO of his record label, are shot at in a drive-by shooting on the strip of Las Vegas, Nevada. 13 shots were made from a car which had 4 people inside, and Tupac was hit by 3 of these bullets. One through his abdomen down to his pelvis, one in his hand, and one through his chest, the latter being the one that would ultimately prove fatal. Suge Knight was the one driving the car, and he's not as badly injured. He speeds away from the scene. He eventually ends up in the trauma unit in critical condition and is placed on life support. He would not come off again. He has to undergo emergency surgery in which he has his right lung removed. It had been completely shattered by the bullet that entered through his chest, and the doctors gave him a 50-50 chance of survival from that point onwards. But sadly, 6 days after he was shot at 4:03 PM on the 13th September 1996, Tupac Shakur is pronounced dead at just 25 years old. His cause of death was listed as a respiratory failure and cardiopulmonary arrest in connection with multiple gun wounds. His death sent shockwaves across the country. Fans had been camped outside the hospital, holding mass prayers and singing his songs, hoping their energy would heal him. People were really devastated about his death. But the big question has always been, who shot Tupac Shakur? To this day in 2020, we still don't have an answer, although there have been many theories throughout the years. In this video, we're going to explore 3 possible explanations, but to do so, we have to travel back a few years to 1993, the year that Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls first meet. Tupac and Biggie were both huge names in the hip-hop scene in America. In 1993, Biggie was just beginning to break onto the scene, whilst Tupac was already a star. The pair immediately strike up a close friendship, so close that they called each other brothers. They performed together on stage, and reportedly Biggie even asked Tupac to become his manager, which Tupac declined. Biggie was already being managed at this point by a man called Sean Combs, who was known by his stage names Puff Daddy or Puffy, as part of Bad Boy Records in New York. Biggie and Tupac's friendship would prove to be relatively short-lived though, because on the 30th of November 1994, Tupac was shot in the lobby of Quad Recording Studios in Times Square, New York. As Tupac and a couple of others stood in the lobby, no bodyguards, 3 other men were also there. Tupac and his associates just assumed that these 3 men were part of Biggie and Puffy's team who were recording upstairs. But before they could reach the lift, these other men pull out guns and attack them. Tupac is shot, beaten, and his jewellery is stolen. He's shot 5 times in total, twice in the groin, twice in the head, and once in the hand. He's taken to hospital and obviously survives, but in that moment, Tupac becomes convinced that Biggie was the one behind the attack, and from then on, the two become enemies. Tupac was convinced it was a setup. He'd only been attending the studio on request from Puffy's team. He thought that Biggie at least knew something was going on and that he turned his head, or that if Biggie didn't know anything, then he should have known. Tupac's argument was that the attackers were men from Biggie's neighbourhood, yet he continued pretending like he didn't know anything. The way that Tupac saw it, it was a betrayal of the worst kind. Although there has never actually been any evidence found that Biggie had anything to do with the shooting, and he's always denied having anything to do with it, Tupac was just convinced he knew something. Tupac attends hospital and has surgery for his wounds, checking him out shortly after, because he had a court date the next day and was waiting for a verdict on his trial. His verdict was announced on the 1st of December, turning up injured and in a wheelchair just the day after he'd been shot. He's sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. He would later talk about this time, saying that nobody visited him, none of his friends or associates he'd made in the hip-hop world. Certainly not Biggie Smalls. And this hurt his feelings a little bit. In fact, he would later go on to say that the only person who would visit him on a regular basis was Suge Knight, the CEO of West Coast Death Row Records. Death Row Records was huge at the time. It was one of the biggest music labels in hip-hop. In October 1995, Tupac's case goes on appeal, but whilst in prison, he'd left his finances in the hands of the wrong people who hadn't made the best financial decisions for him, and he had considerable legal fees. He had no money left, despite being the first artist to have a #1 whilst serving a prison sentence. Me Against the World remained at the top of the charts for 4 consecutive weeks. His bail was $1.4 million, and he couldn't raise it himself. He didn't have the money. So Suge Knight strikes up a deal. He would pay the bail if Tupac would make and release 3 albums under the Death Row label. And just like that, Tupac's released from prison pending appeal, and starts working closely with Suge Knight and Death Row Records. But this was more than a record label for Tupac. It was a new kind of family, the most powerful family in hip-hop at the time. And Tupac's enemies would become Suge Knight's and Death Row's enemies, including Biggie Smalls and Puffy. It was to become an all-out war, of which the first metaphorical shots were fired in August 1995. Suge Knight had just visited Tupac in prison, and he was heading straight to the Source Awards, which were annual awards held by hip-hop magazine Source and Madison Square Garden's Paramount Theatre. Suge takes the stage to accept the award for Best Soundtrack. He makes a statement on that stage. He says, "Any artist out there want to be an artist and want to stay a star and don't want to have to worry about the executive producer trying to be in all the videos, on all the records, dancing, come to Death Row." This was a direct shot made at Puffy and his record label, Bad Boy Records, Biggie Smalls' record label. Puffy was very well known for featuring in all his stars' music videos, and this would begin what would be known as the East Coast West Coast hip hop war, all stemming from Tupac's 1994 shooting. On that day in 94, he decided to make Biggie Smalls an enemy. He decided that Biggie Smalls had wronged him, and when Tupac joined Death Row Records, Biggie Smalls Puff Daddy and Puff Daddy's record label, Bad Boy Records, became an enemy of Death Row. This war became so intense that even fans felt like they had to choose a side, East Coast or West Coast. They couldn't listen to both Bad Boy and Death Row music. They had to choose a side. Everyone had to choose a side. In June 1996, Tupac released a song entitled Hit 'Em Up, which was essentially just a diss track aimed at Bad Boy Records and Biggie Smalls. It was undeniable that it was aimed at them, and it came to embody the East Coast-West Coast rivalry. The fury that Tupac felt over the entire situation is undeniable in this song. He's so angry. And as you can probably imagine, the song didn't go down all too well with people on the East Coast. A lot of people had concerns with Tupac being so involved in Death Row Records, which was sometimes called the most feared label in hip-hop. You probably don't have to be all too well versed in gang culture to have heard of the Bloods and the Crips and the rivalry between the two. The Bloods identified by wearing red and the Crips blue. Suge Knight's CEO had grown up in Compton, and he was a high school and college football star turned music mogul. He was strongly affiliated with the Bloods growing up, and when he became successful and opened up Death Row, he begins to employ people from his childhood, people who hadn't become as successful as him, people who hadn't left the neighbourhood. He wanted to give back and he wanted to give people jobs. Only the majority of people he gave jobs to were Blood gang members. And Suge had plenty of run-ins with the law himself at this point. There was a lot of question over where he'd got the money to even start the label in the first place. Everyone knew you didn't mess with Death Row Records. So just by being associated with Death Row Records and Suge Knight, Tupac was associated with the Bloods and gang culture in general. He essentially puts himself in the firing line here. And as a response to the diss track, it's reported that Biggie started hiring Crips gang members as his security, defending his territory. Which kind of brings us round full circle to the 1996 shooting, the fatal shooting. On the night of September 7th, 1996, Tupac was in Las Vegas, Nevada, celebrating business partner / friend Tracy Robinson's birthday. For Tupac, Vegas was the place he could party and let loose before returning back to business in the recording studio. He attended the Bruce Seldon vs Mike Tyson boxing match with Suge Knight and other associates at the MGM Grand that night. Upon leaving, one of the group spotted a man called Orlando Anderson in the lobby, an alleged Crips gang member from Compton. It was thought that earlier that year, Orlando Anderson had been involved when a member of Death Row's entourage had been robbed at a shoe store. Their gold Death Row Records chain ripped off from around their neck. And this was considered to be a very personal attack. For a Crip to attack something that is Death Row Records, which is strongly Blood affiliated, it's making a statement. So they're in the lobby of the MGM Grand, somebody sees Orlando Anderson and someone whispers something into Tupac's ear. And so Tupac goes up and approaches Orlando and the two begin fighting. And other people quickly join in. Tupac and associates are literally beating up Orlando Anderson in the lobby. It was all caught on the hotel CCTV and is eventually broken up by security. The groups are all removed from the lobby, but incredibly the police are not called, and no incident report is ever made of the attack. In fact, it could only be later confirmed that this happened via the CCTV footage, and this was just 3 hours before the shooting. At 11 PM that night, the group convoyed to a nearby club, Tupac riding passenger in Suge's black sedan. On the way, they're stopped by police for playing the stereo too loud and for not having license plates, but they're allowed to continue without being ticketed. Just 10 minutes after being stopped by the police, at 11:15 PM, they stop at a light. A white 4-door Cadillac pulls up to their right. Someone inside the car rapidly fires a gun, hitting Tupac multiple times. He then goes to hospital and he dies 6 days later. In hospital, only a select number of people were allowed into the waiting room, these people chosen by Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur. Some of these later reported that the police presence at the hospital was very, very poor, despite reports of the attackers threatening to turn up at the hospital to finish the job. Members of the record label acted as security outside Tupac's hospital room because apparently the police wouldn't. After his death, the police investigation goes from attempted murder to a full-on homicide case. But the police weren't exactly having an easy time with the investigation. There were multiple witnesses to the shooting. There was an entourage of around 10 cars following Suge and Tupac. But people were reluctant to talk to them. These were black men who had grown up with a complete distrust of the police. They were taught never to speak to the police weren't on their side. And not only that, a lot of these men also had gang affiliations, pushing their distrust even further. They just simply didn't want to talk to them, and on top of that, they could be seen as snitches for talking to the police, even to help with such an important murder investigation. Even Suge Knight refused to talk, even though he was the one behind the wheel of the car. He famously did a television interview about a year after the shooting and said that he didn't know who shot Tupac, but he wouldn't tell the police even if he did. People just stayed quiet. The police couldn't really get anyone to talk, and the people that did speak had very little information to share. All they could really decipher was that the car was a 4-door white Cadillac, likely with 4 occupants, but that's about it. They couldn't even find a partial number plate. There was apparently one member of the entourage who told Vegas police that he could probably identify the assailant, but the police didn't follow up fast enough, and this person was murdered before the police could get around to interview him. So there were 3 prevailing theories in the early days of this investigation: CEO level, artist level, and gang level. Essentially, that was a result of either Suge Knight, Tupac's feud with Biggie Smalls, or his association with gangs. That's sort of how the police looked at it in the early days. So after the death, rumours began to float around that Tupac was actually done with Death Row Records, that he was intending to leave and start up his own label. And as you can imagine, Suge Knight wouldn't have been all too happy about this. He'd paid for Tupac's bail under the condition that he was to create at least 3 albums with him. At this point, he'd only created 1. So the rumour goes that Suge arranged a hit on Tupac, maybe with the intention to kill him, or maybe just as a threat. Or other rumours say that Suge wanted to simply strengthen the East Coast-West Coast feud, to ensure that Tupac would be safer with him, with the blood gang affiliation, than without him. Now, there's no denying that Suge Knight is a dodgy guy. He's been involved in a lot of crime both before and since the shooting. He's been arrested multiple times for assault and probation violations. In 2014, he was arrested and charged with second-degree robbery, and in 2015 was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter after running over 2 men, which reportedly looked very intentional. He claimed he was acting in self-defence. So we're really not talking about an upstanding member of society here. But Suge was sat next to Tupac in the car that night. He was injured himself alongside Tupac. If he was going to arrange some kind of hit, surely it would make sense if he was also not in the firing line himself, because he very easily could have been the one to end up dead here. And then there's a gang connection. At first, the police dismissed any connection to the fight at MGM Grand and Orlando Anderson. He was interviewed once, and only briefly. Even though the police's immediate thought was that the shooting was gang-related, they failed to make this connection to Orlando. But later, in a police raid on notable Crips gang members, including Orlando Anderson, the police enter his house. Inside, they find a Glock semi-automatic pistol, the same type of gun used in the Tupac shooting. Now, despite the fact that Orlando had the means, motive, and the opportunity to shoot Tupac that night, they had all the circumstantial evidence, the Las Vegas police opted not to arrest him or even question him. You've got to ask yourself, why is that? Did they simply not care to solve Tupac's murder? Was it that they didn't want to get involved in gang wars, or did they know something else? Was the Las Vegas police trying to cover something up? Were they on someone's payroll? The third theory the police call the artist level, which refers to the feud with Biggie Smalls. Did Biggie Smalls organise for Tupac to be shot as a response to the diss track? Had Tupac finally gone too far, hinting in the song that he'd slept with Biggie's wife, Faith? It's probably worth saying though that all reports show that apparently Biggie was beside himself when he heard that Tupac was in hospital in such a bad way. Despite everything, apparently he still saw him as his brother. But of course that doesn't really mean too much. Was the shooting just a result of the East Coast-West Coast war gone too far? We're talking men here with massive egos, tons of money, masculinity and street cred to defend. The street cred, their reputations, were probably one of the most important factors at play here. It was expected for them to respond and bite back to each other's digs. They couldn't just ignore it because they had this street cred to uphold. It just kept going further and further and further. I mean, looking back at it now, it seems obvious that the only way this was going to end was with somebody dead. As a result of the shooting, it became even more dangerous for East Coast rappers to spend time on the West Coast. There was a very real threat of being the victim of violence themselves, of ending up dead themselves. And this was proven on March 8th, 1997. It was the Soul Train Music Awards in Los Angeles, and the after party was held at the Peterson Automotive Museum. But it was shut down soon after it began by fire marshals due to concerns about overcrowding. Biggie and his entourage were among the first to leave the venue just after midnight on the 9th. They begin to drive away and a black Chevy Impala pulls up alongside Biggie's truck. A man dressed in a blue suit rolls down the windows of the Impala. He pulls out a 9mm pistol and fires at Biggie's car, hitting him 4 times. Biggie Smalls is rushed to Cedars-Sinai Hospital where he's pronounced dead at 1:15 a.m. This was just 6 months after Tupac was shot dead, and you don't need to be told that there are obviously many similarities between the two cases. And despite the streets being packed with people leaving the after party, very few people reported being witnesses to this. In the days after the murder, the police interviewed anyone they could find with a connection to this case. They reviewed surveillance tapes, they interviewed people, but eventually the case just goes cold. They apparently had no idea who was responsible. The obvious question is this: were the two deaths related? I think it's undeniable that they probably were. They were likely both the result of the hip-hop war, people defending their territories. But who are these people? Was it the Bloods? Was it Suge Knight? He was the prevailing theory in this death, in Biggie Smalls' death, for many, many years. He probably still is. Was he retaliating for Tupac's death? At the time, Suge Knight was actually in prison for breaking his parole, so he couldn't have personally been the one to fire the shots himself, but it was possible that he organised the hit from prison. And it was well known that Suge had many people within the LAPD working with him, dirty cops on his payroll, so it's no wonder that the case went cold so quickly. In 2002, Biggie's mum actually opened a lawsuit against the LAPD, believing the theory that they were implicated in her son's death. So, as a response, the LAPD opened a task force to investigate themselves, and in a shock to absolutely nobody, they found no validity in the claims that they were involved in the murder. I can't help but feel like it should have been an external source doing this investigating though, because of course the LAPD aren't going to find themselves guilty. Years later, an ex-girlfriend of Suge Knight's spoke to the police, saying that she knew what happened to Biggie Smalls. Suge was in prison at the time, but he wanted revenge for Tupac's murder, so he solicits the murder of Biggie Smalls from prison. This ex-girlfriend identified a specific person as the shooter, but by this point, this person was already dead, so no investigation could take place. But as a result of this girlfriend coming forward, Biggie Smalls' family's lawsuit against the LAPD is retracted, and no charges could be made against Suge Knight because there was no actual evidence apart from this ex-girlfriend's word. Nowadays, there are so many theories over who killed who, who's responsible. If I were to take a guess, I'd say that Tupac's murder was more than likely linked to the attack on Orlando Anderson just 3 hours earlier. It seems like too much of a coincidence for me to believe it could be anything else. I think the gang affiliation became dangerous. But I don't think we'll ever know the exact murderer, but we can probably make a good guess at the general circumstances around it. As for Biggie Smalls, I wouldn't be surprised if Suge Knight was behind it, but it was also known in general that it was dangerous for any East Coast artist to be in LA. The politics behind all of this, the strong gang affiliations, this sense of literal ride or die, will probably be something that most people will never be able to fully grasp and fully understand. I know that I don't. If you want to explore this mystery even further, then I highly recommend checking out Notorious, Tupac Shakur. It dives into everything even further, and it will be on Now TV on Wednesday the 29th of January. A while ago I sort of began my research for this video before Now TV even contacted me, and I found a podcast about this death and all the conspiracies behind it that was 5 hours long, and I listened to a little bit of it, couldn't quite stomach whole 5 hours, but it just shows how much there is behind this case. You can really get right into it, you can really talk about all the conspiracies, but I'm not much of a conspiracy person. I like to talk about the facts, I like to talk about what we know, what we can see, and let you guys think about it from there. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like what I'm doing over here, then make sure you click that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.